fucking niggas since the fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
This is more of a purchasing decision that we're going to make because we have to buy a lot of things. We did another test, came back, everything's positive, everything's healthy. Don't know the gender yet. We're going to know that in November. Everything is healthy. A lot of tests. This is like the third or fourth, test we did. But now, once you reach that point after the first trimester, you're thinking, okay, now I need to start really buying strollers. I need to look at bassinets. What's the difference between a bassinet and a crib? I had to learn all that shit. And then different types of things for different ages. Car seats. Fuck you, car seats. Anyway, but one thing that we were considering buying, and I need your advice on this, because I do think this is a discussion of deep philosophical significance, ontological merit. So they have this device, and stop me if you've heard about this one, but this device called a SNOO, S-N-O-O. Have you heard of that before?
I've heard the word, but I'm not making a connection on what it is.
All right. So basically, it's a bassinet. So a bassinet is something you have newborns in. This is prior to when you put them in a crib. I know you know this. I'm saying this for other people who don't know. This is for when the baby is so young. There's a lot of dangers when you have a baby that young. It can very easily suffocate if it's laid incorrectly, if it's not on its back. There's tens of thousands of babies that die every single year just because they roll over on their face or something. This is why swaddling is so important and other things of that nature. Anyway, the SNOO is a bassinet for very, very young babies. But what it is, it's this new type of space-age technology. And what it is, it's a bassinet with motorized functions and artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities.
Hi, I'm Dr. Harvey Karp. Ask any new parent and they'll tell you exhaustion is their #1 stress. So I began to wonder, could we make a totally new bed that rocks and shushes babies all night long to automatically calm crying and boost sleep? Well, with the help of top engineers and hundreds of test parents, we did it. SNOO is the smartest baby bed ever made. And here's why. Its womb-like sensations add an hour or more to a baby's sleep. And when he hears crying, SNOO automatically chooses the best white noise and jiggly motion to soothe the fussing, often in under a minute.
And this is very popular with celebrities. It's around $1,800. Probably $2,000, there's different levels of it, I think, but around $2,000 for this thing. And what it does is when your baby is in it and it is crying, it will listen to the pitch and tone and severity and how the baby is crying and automatically figure out the way to rock it back to sleep. And it's got some crazy high success rate, like a 90% success rate. And people swear by this. They say, oh my God, because the one thing that happens to young parents, I'm sure you can cop to, is that babies cry a lot during that stage for the first 6 months or so, and you need to rock it back to sleep. You got to sleep train it, you got to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
This is supposed to, what was the number? The number was something like new parents lose, the number sounds crazy, and I don't know if I believe it, but it says they lose like 6 weeks of sleep for the first year of the...
No, that makes sense. That sounds correct.
It does it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look forward to it.
This gets you back on track. Now, my wife really wanted it, and she said we can probably get this, and people swear by it. But there's two ways to look at this. Being the trad guy, I just start thinking but is it important to the child's development, even at that young of an age, that it sees you rocking the cradle, that you are in the vicinity? That's not just a robot doing it, the hand that rocks the cradle, as they say. Is that significant, not just in a traditional sense, but also to that child bonding to you in some way? So I had that question. But, I say that as a guy who's not going through it. Every fucking parent I've talked to, regardless of political inclination, has said, no, you should get that. I don't care. I would do it in a heartbeat. So I don't know. What do you think? Based on what I've told you.
Well, my youngest just got through that stage 6 months ago, so it's fresh in my mind. And there are situations where the kid is gonna cry, like the kid was asleep, and they've started to cry a little bit, and you can before they open their eyes go and just gently rock them and they'll go back to sleep. There are cases like that. There's cases like that where that's okay. I think that's okay. But there are cases where the kid is crying because the kid peed or is hungry or has a rash, and in those other cases, you can still put them back to sleep by rocking them. But you shouldn't, because you fucking peed. You need to change the diaper or give them some food. So to me, there's it's not that this device is negligent parenting, but it opens the doorway to negligent parenting especially if you're a new parent. I think if I had one, I'd probably use it, but I wouldn't pay for one at market rate, because I know that it's going to make it too easy for me to just be lazy, because their parents are right. If you don't have the option and you're strung to it, then after a few weeks or months of this, you get really, really tired. And there are nights where you want to just scream because you haven't been able to sleep for days and days and days. But part of that process is you are actually taking care of your child. That's why the child is screaming. It's asking you to take care of it. And then the other part of it is you can't always rock them back to sleep. That's the third case. The child's crying. No amount of rocking is going to put them back to sleep, because they actually need to be picked up and dealt with. And the act of picking them up, and now they have their eyes open and you're holding them against your skin and you're talking to them. And this is an important part of the child's development. So I wouldn't say no to the thing. I think if you've got the money for it and you can, and you know if you have a plan, like if you've read about parenting, you've read about child development, and you actually have a plan and a schedule, and you know, hey, at these, like I think a lot of new parents don't even consider this, but it's like even for an infant, you have to set bedtimes, you have to set rest times, nap times, you're timing the food, you're timing everything. If you're already on that schedule and you're sticking to it, this could be totally fine. But for parents that are just like, I want an opportunity to just ignore my kid and go back to my life before I had a kid, well, you shouldn't even have a fucking kid. And you definitely shouldn't have one of these devices, because it's not going to help you be honest to your kid.
Well, this is precisely what my wife was noticing with some of the reviews, and this is what she was scared of, which was that there's people who really, really rely on it.
Yeah.
And there's people who are like, oh my God, I'm traveling to another country and we can't bring the snoo. What do? We don't know how to handle our child. So that is the extreme of that.
See, that's frightening. Yeah.
So I don't, and we would not become that, obviously, but it is a part of it. It is that, people some people, especially if they don't have kids, will look at you and it's like, oh, so you're deciding to adopt man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. And I'm like, I guess. But also, when I speak to real parents, they're like, I don't care how Roman they want to be. I don't care how many fucking cross necklaces they have on or how tall their Eastern Orthodox hat is. It seems that once they go through that because also these people are the ones who want to have 9 kids.
Yeah.
So I'm like, yeah, I think by kid 3, you're going to be like, give me a magic robot to make this easier. Because my wife is going to bed with a knife with my name on it. I don't know why.
For us, it was our second daughter. I don't know. Well, actually, my wife just stepped down here. But for our second daughter, it seemed easier, I think. I remember being much more frustrated about the amount of time that you are, woken up by the kid and that you have to deal with them and the disruption to your life. I think by the second kid, you're already kind of adjusted to it. At the very least, your expectations are in line, so you know what you're getting into, and you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a limited period that this happens. It's a number of months, right? It's not even a full year that this happens. And there's different challenges after that. But the period where that specific thing is applicable is like maybe 5-6 months, something like that. So I think if you're having many kids, I think by the time you got to your 5th kid, this would just be old hat and it wouldn't bother you, because you'd have all the schedule. The other thing is, like, a lot of the reasons that kids are waking up in the middle of the night, at least that aside from very specific ages, like when they're very young infants, you can actually prevent all of that just by proper scheduling and nutrition, and like making sure they have naps at the
really
times.
Do you have any tips?
It's different for every kid. You have to kind of get used to the kid, but I mean, you have to be measuring out. I mean, okay, we have a medical issue, so we use formula, but we measure out the exact amount of formula and the type of formula and when the kid gets the formula. If you don't do that, then you're going to have overfeeding, which makes them gassy, and or you're going to have underfeeding and they're going to be hungry. And then you have to make sure all the time that the temperature and the humidity is correct, which is not a science. It's just like, you look at the kid and be sympathetic. Does that look comfortable? Because if you're not paying attention, go in and pay a little bit of attention. Because if, like, even my eldest daughter was crying last night, and it's like, well, why is she crying? She's almost 3. Well, because the mat was blocking the central air and the room was the wrong temperature and she's uncomfortable. She's like sweating, actually. So that's an easy fix. Somebody should be paying attention. So stuff like that. If you're just paying attention, a lot of this doesn't come up as badly. So
yeah. And then the worst thing imaginable in that situation would be a robot there that is just shaking it at incrementally violent patterns.
Yeah. Well, it's not even getting into the question of whether or not you trust this robot to not just shake the kid dead. Like, I don't know how it works. I don't know what safety features are involved in this.
Yeah. Well, it really is. You really fall for the old infomercial trick where I'm watching the promotional video on the site and the guy's like, hello, I'm Dr. the creator of it. And he's wearing a lab coat or a doctor's coat. They might be the same coat. I don't know. But I'm like, oh, I trust this guy. I'm doing the boomer routine. I'm falling for a guy who's just in a white coat. I'm like, who the fuck is this guy? He's a guy who runs a company. There's functionally no difference between him and the MyPillow guy.
Yeah.
So, but like, why am I like, we've tested this. I'm taking your word for it.
Yeah.
And what you're supposed to be excited by is, I'm going to use the word space age because it's still relevant because space still is cool. That it's like, oh, I don't know how it judges by the severity of the crying because, like you said, it could be crying because it wet itself. That's something you say about a grown-up, but it made a mess of things. And then what's it going to do? Yeah. And then if you're the parent in the other room, just like, oh, it'll take care of it. Now you got a piss baby. There's one type of baby you don't want. You don't want a pee pee poo poo baby.
Yeah.
They grow up to be, what do they grow up to be? A girl.
Liberals, Biden voters. That's the funny package assumption is that all crying can be resolved by rocking the baby. That's it's like, this will solve all your problems because everybody knows the only thing that you ever need to do to help a child is rock it back and forth. Like, no, are you not a parent? And there's a lot of stuff you have to do still.
That is like one of the bits of parental wisdom that the pre-boomers would tell them. Because like we said, boomers get a lot of bad rap. Boomer parents are way dumber than boomers. Boomers were just really hedonistic and maybe even slightly smarter. I think boomers were smart enough to realize the game they were playing. Boomer parents were ones that just repeated old folksy wisdom that might have hurt the baby. Like, yeah, just rock the baby. And if it rock it harder, if it's crying harder, just shake a baby until it stops. Like, that's what a fucking pilgrim bitch would tell you.
Yeah.
Not even the witches. But it's funny, like, this entire topic I don't think there's any right answer to it. Some people will have a disdain and a distrust towards any technological, encroachment into the parental thing. I think that's a healthy distrust.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we've landed on not getting it, to be honest, because we went back and forth. We saw all these examples of people who just couldn't wrap their minds around a life without it. And that seemed, and also that's a lot of money. We can spend that money on other stuff. We can spend that money on fucking diapers, which you're going to, so a $2,000 it's not nothing.
Yep.
If I hand you $2,000 right now, I think you'd be happy. I don't think you'd light it on fire.
Yeah.
Me, I go, gee whiz, I grab it right out of your hand. Even if you weren't offering it to me, you put $2,000 in front of my face, it's gone.
A couple of big ones. Give me that.
Yeah. But it's funny that this is, it's a deep concern about these things. And it's a concern of, you feel like you're losing the real. You feel like you're losing something human. And even if you can't articulate exactly why, it seems to happen with everyone. I think this cuts across a lot of different types of people, a lot of different races as well. And that's one thing I noticed about Marxists. On this show, we've covered quite a bit of Marxist literature and Marxist theory in the past. For those, you can find those clips if you scroll down on our Odyssey page. If you go to our site, bloodsatellite.ca, you can find clips on there. So we covered Louis Althusser on ideology. We read Capital by Marx and covered it. We covered Baudrillard and hyperreality. We've covered a lot of Marxist-like things. And what I always found interesting about Marxists was, even though they're materialists, a lot of them, not even necessarily scientific materialists, but they tend to be materialists, especially old Marxists, talking about, commodities and money and things. I found, and this people who have Marxist inclinations or leftist inclinations might push back on me on this, but this is just my experience with all of this. My experience with reading Marxism over the course of the 20th century was, Marxists and communists made a lot of predictions about how the revolution would go, and those predictions did not come to pass for various reasons. But some of the predictions they made were straight up proven wrong about the adoption by the working class across the globe. So I think really with Marxist theory, over the course of the 20th century, it's like 100-year cope, explaining why it didn't work and going deeper and deeper and more metaphysical into the reasons why it didn't work. And I think that century-long cope up until the present has yielded some interesting stuff. When I talked about Marxist theory in the past, the example I gave, or the metaphor, was when you discover Marxist theory and the depth of it and the expansiveness of it, because there's a lot out there. There's so much Marxist theory and these famous Marxist philosophers and economists. It's like coming across a bottomless pit. So if you treat it seriously and come across it, it's like a bottomless pit. So you're wondering, is this natural or is this man-made? Because that's a question you ask yourself when you see Marxist theory. It's like, is this all just you making up a bunch of intellectual bullshit, or are you actually trying to describe the world as is? Is this natural or is it man-made? And at a certain point, you don't care, and you just want to drop some rocks in it. That's kind of my relationship with Marxist theory, that I came across it and it's like, let me figure this out. It's entrancing once you see the scope of it. Like, you kind of want to just know more. And I think the entire concept of hyperreality came out of Marxist thinkers. And then in that sense, I always look at it like, Marxists do recognize a sort of spirituality. And when I listen to Haas Infrared, he's a famous, known online communist Marxist. He might call himself a Stalinist, whatever. I'm not going to get into all those semantics, but he talks a lot about very spiritual sounding things. They talk about the real. When they critique capitalism, when they critique modernity, it's from the position that there is something deep and human. Like they are almost talking about the soul. They won't mention the soul itself, because that has connections to religion and stuff. But to understand what the hyperreal is, to know when something's fake, to know when something is a copy of a copy of a copy, you have to start by saying there is something fundamentally human and ontologically almost pure, like something you're trying to get back to. That's what I always found interesting. And the conversation we're just having about, the mechanization of baby rearing, if we want to call it that, that's almost that could be seen in a Marxist way too. It's like, oh, you're mechanizing and becoming less real and less human. But I'm also saying, yeah, but if I were to say this to a Marxist, I'm curious about what they would say, because I'm like, it sounds like you're making an appeal to tradition. But Marxists they don't like tradition. They usually see it as something that's made up. This is where Louis Althusser and on ideology is talking about. The entire concept of an ideology ties in this idea of a superstructure. A superstructure in society is this grand ideological framework that nothing can really exist outside of or escape from. And anything that does exist outside of it and threatens it is destroyed, which is this sort of Marxist idea that, and you see this in the Cathedral, when people talk about the Cathedral, which was popularized by Mencius Mollebug. This is why I say a lot of these NRX guys are just Marxist guys. They're post-leftists. And, I would be wary about some of the things they say. But when they talk about, the cathedrals, this idea, this superstructure that, everything is a part of it, even things that are seemingly against it are actually part of it. And it's all like a fake thing. But even with Marx, it's like, it seems like they're trying to get to something real. But they need to get to something real while also claiming that tradition's bullshit, that everything that we think is real is also bullshit. So they need to wage a war on two fronts constantly. And that's why I think they have to create new language, a new lexicon, new theories of other theories and stuff. But that's where the bottomless pit comes in, where I look at it, but I'm like, it's fascinating that this does exist. The reason Marxist critique exists is because it's addressing something that's real. And like we said before, maybe some people disagree with this, but I do see Marxism and fascism as branching off of liberalism. They are reactions to liberalism. Neither of these things exist without liberalism, I think. And it's the understanding of the individual and things like that, for better or worse. And that's why fascism and Marxism position liberalism as its enemies too, because it's trying to solve for these other problems proposed by liberalism. And I think Marxism might have more of a strong theoretical backing because it has to make up so much theory, it has to make up so much new shit. But like I said, there's some interesting stuff. And so when I here, I got it. So I read a book recently that was pretty challenging because I jumped in feet first into the middle of the bottomless pit. And it helped that I had some grounding by actually reading Marx and reading some other stuff. And I don't agree with everything in this book. Let me just preface this by saying that I find it interesting though. And there are things in here that did pique my interest. So the book is called Incontinence of the Void by Slavoj Žižek. Now Žižek is a pretty well-known guy. I think in terms of philosophers, he's probably one of the more famous ones. Name another philosopher. If you disagree with that, name literally any philosopher existing right now without looking it up. And Sam Harris doesn't count. And I don't think Jordan Peterson actually counts either. He's not really a philosopher. So, really, I'm just saying. Yeah.
I love this idea that Zizek is the only philosopher.
Really? Well, he's the only philosopher that seems to get the interest of young people who are unplugged from that whole... Because if you want to have a bad time, go look at philosophy forums and philosophy subreddits and philosophy little communities. It's just bickering. It's the dumbest shit you've ever seen. It is positively loathsome. But here's a guy who seems to exist outside that. He's a celebrity philosopher. He like Jordan Peterson, he shows up on shows he has no business being, and he's showing up on fucking podcasts. Who the fuck else? What other philosopher is showing up podcasts? Scientists do it all the time. I cannot really think of one. So at the very least, that's saying he's relevant. And so this is an interesting book. Zizek wrote a lot of books. I picked this one because I wanted to just read a few. And this one really throws you in deep into the center of, and he references other books. His first big one was called The Sublime Object of Ideology. Some people say start with that one. But I jumped into this because he also writes books about like COVID and shit and movie reviews, which I have no interest in. He's a guy who could really use a blog, in my opinion. He just writes books about topics, but if he just had if he published more articles and blogs, some of these wouldn't need to be books, I don't think. Yeah. Anyway, maybe I have the wrong read on that. Anyway, but I read this and I think this gave a good overview of his entire worldview and how it relies on Hegelian dialectics. And you cannot understand Zizek without understanding his relationship with Hegel, a famous philosopher. Everyone would put him up with the greats. And also this guy named, I'm going to get his name wrong, but his name was Lacan, Lacan. It could be Lacen, it could be Lacan.
We have these three crucial authors to whom Žižek declares allegiance. Foremost is Hegel, particularly his dialectic, where thought, history, and freedom all develop dialectically, which means each struggles against oppositions, negations, to become more universal. But there's a problem with Hegel's dialectic for Žižek. It's not perfect yet. Difference is always ultimately subsumed. It appears only so that it can disappear. So it's relative difference, which is to say, Hegel doesn't take it seriously enough. Now, Žižek's way to fix this, to give contradiction its due, is to inject Lacan. The stew must include permanent difference and pure repetition. And to that end, the next ingredient is Lacan's subject. We'll just say you. You appear via contradictions that are never resolved. Marx offers a vision of real freedom rooted in egalitarianism. And there's some other Marxist baggage we can pick up too. What prevents egalitarian freedom today? Well, capitalism, and specifically ideology in the Marxist sense, which shapes the desire that we took from Lacan back here.
And I'm going to just give you some notes from this book that I read that I thought were pertinent, that helped me see how he sees the world. Because by reading this book, I felt like I understood more about how Marxists see the world. And Slavoj Žižek is an interesting character because a lot of people on the right are kind of like him because they see that he pushes back on trans stuff. They see that he pushes back on a lot of the woke progressive stuff. You know, he sees that as, you know, he might critique that as just an outgrowth of capitalism. He's an anti-capitalist.
Sexual difference, for me, in my Lacanian perspective, is not simply a normative order, and then we have to open it up to plurality of positions and so on and so on. Of course, we should do this, but now I come to my second reproach. Things are here terribly serious. For example, I almost had to laugh when, in one of the but very strong versions of LGBT in the United States, the idea is, under the false, she disagrees with it privately, influence of Judith Butler, that we should treat gender identity as just a free play of performative enactment, ironic repetition, reconstruction, and so on and so on. I don't think it's so playful.
But, you know, he's not a guy who's in line with progressive issues, and he says a lot of politically incorrect things. And he's a funny guy. He's got a sense of humor. You listen to him talk. He's a character because of how he talks, but also because he actually has a sense of humor, and he's funny, and he seems to understand the value of kind of playing a character.
When I give a talk, or especially if it's a debate, it's good to begin on time or even a little bit earlier. Because then people who are even on time or 2 minutes late feel a little bit guilty, you know.
Why do you want them to feel guilty? Just so
because they don't ask stupid, annoying questions.
Yeah, so his view, like, it has to start with Hegel. So he would say that Hegel and all German idealism as a movement are a form of anti-philosophy to show the inconsistencies of other philosophies. So once you understand that Hegel, the Hegelian critique, they don't see that as philosophy. They see that as existing outside of philosophy. And so by employing this Hegelian critique and this worldview, they critique philosophy and existence itself. So once you understand that component and understand that they're using this to critique Immanuel Kant, they're using this to critique everything, every aspect of society, you're like, okay, that's why Marxism itself also sees itself as standing outside of politics. And so once you understand how a lot of these, you know, theory guys, they see Marxism as a completely unprecedented and unduplicated phenomena that exists, but fascism and democracy and all that is part of this other structure, but they're the only ones that are, you know, unique to that. I think that also explains the worldview as well. And why, you know, I'm not politics, I'm anti-politics is something he would probably say. And he says the book uses the triad of the universal, which is ontology, particular, sexuality, and singular for subjectivity. So he says that when you look at these problems, you have to kind of address them at 3 different levels. There's the ontological, which is universal, but the particular is sexuality. Now, what does that mean? Now, one thing that I got from this book and from his mentor, who is Lacan, or Laysan, I'm going to say Lacan. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. But is that everything is downstream from sexuality. He outright says this a few times.
Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst and psychiatrist, sometimes referred to as the French Freud, and is regarded as an important figure in the history of psychoanalysis. The imaginary, the symbolic, the real, and the mirror stage are some of Lacan's most notable ideas. His teachings explore the significance of Freud's discovery of the unconscious, proposing a return to Freud.
Just like he views Hegel as a critique of philosophy, he views psychoanalysis as a critique of everything else too. So psychoanalysis sits at the center of, in my opinion, the Marxist understanding of people. So they will, the idea of fetishes and the idea of all that's everything Freud said, as far as I can tell, they're really big proponents of. So if you have a problem with psychoanalysis and you have a problem with Freud specifically and what the psychoanalytic movement, that revolution represented, you're really going to hate Marxism, because it affirms all of that. And not only does it affirm it, it goes way, way deeper into it.
What is I, you, me, identity, persona? When you think of yourself, do you think of yourself as a whole, unified person? I think, therefore I am. Jacques Lacan, the most important psychoanalyst since Freud, theorized in 1936 that what we think of as our own identity is actually imaginary, a construct behind which the real subject resides. Lacan called the development of this identity the mirror stage. He posited that the first time an infant sees itself in the mirror, literally or figuratively, is the moment that the child develops a sense of the self.
Hegel had 3 levels of thought. There's the relationship between logic and metaphysics, that's one thing. The second was the relationship between mechanism and organic life, and the relationship between state and civil society. So that's kind of what these Marxists always go back to, that second one too, the relationship. They understand there's a separation between organic life and mechanistic life, of machines, of everything that's created, everything that's produced. But so like they have a grasp of something real, something organic, arguably something spiritual. But what I found through the course of this book is they will never admit that it's anything to do with religion, anything to do with tradition. And when they admit to that, you end up in really strange areas. So you end up in an area, for example, where he's quoting Lacan. He says something to the effect of, lesbians are the only true heterosexuals.
What?
So, yeah, he says that. And he says it like, but of course that's the case. I'm like, okay, hold on, back up. Now, part of me, when someone sees that, they'll spit their water at the screen. Me, I kind of want to know more about that. Like, okay, tell me how you got to that point. I need to know.
Show your math. Yeah, please.
He believes, and he believes that everything is sexed. Everything is downstream from sex. All politics, which is an interesting take, because some people on our side would say everything is downstream from biology and genetics and ethnicity and things like that. But he says everything is downstream from sex, and like the man and the woman. And the way he outlines it, I might butcher this, but just to give you an idea of why he says this. So from a philosophical perspective, okay, he says, first of all, he doesn't believe in the traditional Marxist and communist statement that we can overcome class antagonisms and have this sort of flat, holistic, good society. Because a lot of the communists and Marxists would say there's class antagonism, middle class, upper class, lower class, and that antagonism is the true conflict in society. It's not ethnicity, it's not race, it's not all that, it's just class struggle. And we can solve that struggle. Now, where Žižek goes, and a lot of these other philosophers go, they say that it is that very tension, that very conflict that makes existence happen. And he said that, and that was interesting. I'm like, okay, what do you mean by that? And he kind of goes on where he ties it to sex too. He's like, the only reason that we have the universe as we know it is because of the impossibility of the one. We have this thing called perfection. If the universe were perfect, it would just be like this perfect balance, almost non-existent thing. And he said that, the entire reason we have 2 sexes is due, and this is where we get into like the metaphysical, ontological shit, but it's like the reason we have 2 is because of the impossibility of having 1. Like the 1 would be perfection, but we can't have that. And because perfection can never exist, we have to have these various states. And that's what man and woman are, he said, because there's not just one gender. There can't be. because it's impossible in the universe to have perfection. And because we live in a universe where we can never achieve perfection, we're always going to have antagonisms between these two things. We're always going to have antagonisms between men and women, and lightness and darkness, everything. So he says, like, really, and this is a total inversion of what I think Marxists said, which is that we can never achieve perfection. Our entire existence can only ever be conflict and living in the space of that antagonism, right? And the way he said that, I'm like, well, that's interesting. Like, I hear that, and even though it's coming from a Marxist, like, Now, a lot of people who push back on that, because a lot of phenomenologists, like we've spoken to in the past, a lot of Christians, any religious person would, fight against this, because they have to believe that there is a true universal truth, a universal perfection behind the scenes, an absolute that we can reach. So if you believe that, then this will all sound like hogwash to you. But as he's working through this, but seeing how he relates that to sex, so he's kind of made sex a universal constant. You see what I'm saying? I'm like, that's interesting. And then the ways you join together and things like that. So I'm like, okay, I see where he's going with this. But he says that beneath all of our ideology, all of everything, there is just the man versus woman, and then everything else is just window dressing, which I don't believe. I don't agree with all this, but it shows the depth at which these guys are thinking of this. And I'm not a fan of the psychoanalytic movement, but I'm not against the idea of trying to understand how the human mind works. I don't want to completely say that, because there's some people who say, like, there's no such thing as mental illness. I don't believe that. It's obvious that that's not true. It's obvious that there's ways we can look at how the human mind works and how certain universal behaviors and reactions work. But I do think the psychoanalytic movement, spearheaded by Freud and the Frankfurt School, frankly, it had other political inclinations to it. But because of this, he believes that true ontology is impossible. That's why he's anti-Immanuel Kant. Because if you believe that the universe is just conflict and kind of sexual anger, there's no true ontology. There is no philosophy. There is no truth. So if you're starting from the basis of there is no universal truth, now all of this makes sense, doesn't it? And that's why he rejects sexual fluidity as a capitalist invention. So if you speak to a lot of Marxists right now, they will say the same thing. They might say it in a different term, but they will say that this idea of sexual fluidity, like, you need to have a traditional overview of sexuality to be a Marxist. Now, maybe some Marxists disagree with that, but then they would argue they're not real Marxists. But then he says some kind of things that I don't agree with. Like, he says that we need sexual education at all times, especially for children, because we need sexual education at all times because humans are always thinking about sex except when they're having sex. And then here's another. Lacan says only lesbians are heterosexual, while gays and straights are the real homosexuals. Again, I'm not sure I agree with that. But then he'll kind of grasp at what the soul is. So he's got a part here where he says the soul is the principal form of the organism. So, like, the organism itself is the soul. And this sort of immaterial life force that keeps it united. So he talks about the soul like an immaterial life force, divorced from religion. So that's what the soul is. Well, the subject, he says, is the anti-soul. It's the technical that reduces it to sort of an alien singularity. So there's this idea that the soul is connected to all other souls, but then there's this sort of materialism that drops over it that makes it separate and alienated. And that's the experience of us. That's the experience of human beings, that we feel like we have the soul, but we are alienated. And that's why you become like a subject. And a subject is sort of this thing that really can't have an effect on the world. And that's what people struggle against.
Like Freud, Lacan claims that the ego is constructed by the unconscious. But that is where the similarity ends, as Lacan develops a different notion of the ego, which is not a regulating instance between the id and the superego, but an elaborate organization of images and identifications. So it is that we come to doubt the very principles of Cartesian philosophy, where I think, therefore I am, can be turned upside down and rephrased, as Lacan would, into I think where I am not, therefore I am where I do not think. The very sentence that describes the split subject. To understand the meaning of this statement, we must come to it as a conclusion. Therefore, we must inspect why the subject is located in the unconscious, not the ego, and why it is split.
And he talks about this tribe. I know we have to get going soon, but I just want to talk about this tribe he talks about called the Winnebago tribe. There's this Winnebago tribe in America it's a real tribe. That's where the Winnebagos were based off of. But they're split into two castes. They did studies on this tribe. And each had to draw a picture of the village. Each caste had draw an image of what represents the village. So the higher caste drew it balanced and everything. It's kind of like just a thing, a place where people are, kind of scattered throughout. Then the other one drew a circle that was divided in half. So the lower caste saw it as divided, the higher caste saw it as all intermingled. And he had said, and this is where we get into sort of a philosophical side, where he says, the real here, in his mind, the real reality is not the village itself, but in his words, the kernel of trauma of the class antagonism between the village itself. It is the thing that is not possible and that which distorts our approach to it. So it's like, what is real? Is it just a village of people, or is the more fundamental thing below just the village organization, how the village is almost spiritually organized, and how that's what the caste is. You see what I'm saying? Like he's trying to kind of go at a deeper level of what organization actually is, not just a place where people are, but the deeper thing of how they relate to each other. And so that's kind of the understanding. And that's what communists and Marxists say, that, a nation isn't just people working together. A nation or a group is actually all these intersecting traumas and all these intersecting things that separate us from what they would argue is the soul. So it's almost anarchist in that sense. That's where I think Marxism crosses over into anarchism. Like they are trying to get to the root of something real, something human, but they can't really attach a traditional name to it. I think that's where they have to keep coming up with all this stuff, and where they end up in places where you say lesbians are the only heterosexuals. So what do you think about this so far? I know we got to get going soon, but what do you think of all this? I'm kind of going off and trying to give an overview because it gets really detailed about other things, but what do you think so far?
I think there's an idea, I'm grasping at straws here, but like that sex is foundational to everything in the sense that that being related to conflict. So conflict and sex, and there's kind of an idea of maybe synthesis there, where you can't have like entropy, right? Like if the fact that things are in motion means that things are in conflict, they're moving against each other and interacting, so it always has to be that way. I get that. And then a lot of the conclusions based on that, such as children needing sexual indoctrination and lesbians being the only true heterosexuals, is completely insane. It's show me your fucking math. And I think that this exact shit is the reason why I have absolutely no interest in even reading philosophy. I think you said earlier something along the lines of you read enough Marxist like background. I almost said theology, not theology. You read Marxist theory, and after a while you just want to start throwing bricks at them. That's me with most philosophy. Like I hear enough of it. It's like, look, I'm sorry, you're right. I didn't read all of the book, but I don't really care. I'm not really interested in your justifications. I just want to throw a brick at you. I just want you to shut the fuck up. So.
And I know we got to go soon because you have to go and clean up your Texas Chainsaw Massacre house. But just to end on two things, back to Hegel, just to really establish what I was talking about. Like Hegel states that there is no way back to existential unity, really. But he says that the spirit is the true engine of the universe. That is what he says. So again, there's an approximation of something that we would agree with. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at here. Like there is a common ground. And when I read the stuff, I'm like, I hear echoes of stuff that we talk about as well, just a different conclusion. And I just want to get back to the main thing that I really took from this, that even though I don't necessarily agree with, I thought was interesting. And it's from, I think, page 50 here. He says, this is kind of what I was saying before, existence is possible through its own impossibility. He kind of goes into theoretical quantum physics on here talks about the idea of superpositions. So, because remember when we talked about quantum mechanics, about how can we know the location of a quantum particle like an electron, and then the way it actually works is it's in every state in the universe at once, and there's a calculation, I think it's called Feynman's sum over paths, to calculate where an electron can be, but for a moment it's almost everywhere at once. But it can only have its location by its impossibility of being everywhere in the universe. So in that sense, he's really taking a quantum mechanical view of existence at this point, which is what I find interesting. That's what kind of got me here, where I'm like, okay. And that's like, the existence of heterosexuality exists because of the impossibility of the one. Existence only exists because of its impossibility of like being in a different form. So we are, the existence as we know it is the result. He calls it the obstacle to being which sustains being. And I just thought that was an interesting way of looking at it. So as opposed to other Marxists that people might come across, he is saying that rather than this conflict and this antagonism between classes as being something you can solve, he's saying that that's the only thing that exists. The only thing that exists is conflict and antagonism and messiness. And that can map very, very well onto a very specific view of human sexuality given to us through psychoanalysis. Now, I didn't get to talk about a lot of what I wanted to talk about with this today, because there's a lot I thought was interesting about this, and we need to get going right now, I know. But I just wanted to give an introduction to it and kind of give people a taste of what he's talking about. And his idea, the one last thing I'll talk about, which relates to modernity, is when he says that like his problem with modernity is that it really separates the technical from the organic. And he says the separation of the mechanical and organic is like the rise in self-interest and the mutation of religion into repetitive tasks. So even he talks about, like, people practice religion, but they don't really. They just kind of spiritlessly and soullessly do these rituals. They don't know why they're doing it, but there is no... Even a non-religious guy, can look at much of the churches, and even Christians would say that. Like, a lot of these people don't really believe in it. They don't practice anything. It's just a soulless ritual. So he says modernity separates mechanical technique from organic subjectivity, meaning people split their lives into one half being soulless tasks, and the other half is their secret interests or goals, since their decisions are separated from these entire global mechanisms. Now, when he says that, I'm like, okay. That sounds like something I think everyone on the right would agree with too. Now, it goes in all different directions from there, but I just wanted to kind of give a preview of some of the ideas that he brings to the table, that even if I don't agree with them, I think they're interesting and I think they could be discussed. Anyway, I know you gotta get going right now, but
yeah, I would say there is a reason that people pay attention to Žižek compared to other theorists on that side, right? Like, he does have this smorgasbord of ideas. He is playing with a large deck of very nicely decorated cards, so cool. I like the way he talks mostly. Yeah. Anyway.
All right, and he makes people upset. He owns the libs, and so if you're a fan of lib ownership, you like this guy too. Anyway, we'll see how many people get angry at me for this one.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.